Thank you, Asa. In today's presentation, I'm going to talk about values, valuation, and the IPBES, and some observations. I would like to be honest upfront. You will be surprised that there will not be any equations or numbers that I will be showing in this presentation. So in that sense, it might be a little bit abstract. Nevertheless, let's go ahead and I will start talking about what that acronym IPBES stands for and what's its approach to values and valuation. And then at the very end, I'll share some of my observations about values and valuation based on the IPBES approach. So first of all, let me introduce what this acronym stands for, IPBES. IPBES stands for the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. I'm sure several of you are familiar with this, but some of you might finding this acronym a little bit weird, and what does it mean? So that's what it is. The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, established in 2012 in Panama as a part of the Convention on Biological Diversity process. And at the moment, it has 137 countries as members. Primarily, it works based on the demand from the governments. And it has two fundamental objectives: provide knowledge-based, policy-relevant suggestions to the government in relation to planet's biodiversity, ecosystems, and the contribution of ecosystems to people. In other words, in IPBES language, they refer it as nature's contribution to people, which is basically ecosystem services. Well, that's the one objective. And the other one is, again, to support governments through design and development of policy tools and methods that could help to protect nature and help to use nature in a sustainable way in countries, by societies, and so forth. Within the broad mission of this organization, which is to strengthen knowledge foundations for better policy through science. So one of the key elements that IPBES advocates is we need to provide policy relevant suggestions based on scientific evidence. So knowledge foundation, strengthening knowledge foundation through different functions that it does, informing policy and trying to make changes in practice. That's its basic mission. So within this mission, it has 4 core functions. The first function is to conduct assessments. Second is to develop policy support tools. Third is to act as an agent to build capacity where needed. And the fourth is also on demand from the governments generate new knowledge. Within these 4 core functions, the assessment relates to understanding the knowledge base or the evidence base about a particular theme, for example, land degradation and restoration, or a general biodiversity and ecosystem service in a region or even globally. In the same way, it develops policy support tools that might help government to implement conservation programs or other programs that relate to managing nature or generating benefits from those sort of management and so forth. Similarly, capacity building refers to where needed. It also provides training and support to governments to build capacity in conserving and managing nature. As at the very end, knowledge generation is also one of the things, which means it does not conduct its own research, but through different mechanisms, it could produce new knowledge that could be useful for the government. So these are 4 fundamental core functions, and it operationalizes these functions through a framework, which I'm going to detail now, called the Conceptual Framework. A particular conceptual framework. So we might agree or disagree with this, but I'll go ahead and explain what it means. This is their conceptual framework. Hopefully I'll just try. We'll see how I go. So there are 3 elements, interrelated elements here that we think when it comes to nature and nature's contribution to people or good quality of life. These 3 things are interrelated in between human and non-human world, for example, in a broad sense. So you see colors here. These colors have slightly different meanings. For example, the green colors represents the Western scientific view of nature. When you think about nature, we think about biodiversity and ecosystem. That's how they characterize it. But it can be viewed quite differently from if we change the world view. If it is about local communities and indigenous and local communities perspective, they might say about Mother Earth to nature or systems of life to nature. So one of the things in IPBES approach is to bring this perspective forward or treat as far as possible equally in terms of the Western scientific view of thinking about nature and managing nature. So this is a sort of a mechanism by which nature contributes to quality of life through different types of goods and services. They are collectively called in IPBES terminology as nature's contribution to people. The only reason I can think why they changed that name is nature is not always pleasant in some cases. Nature provides benefits, yes, but at the same time, it also provides costs. I'm living next to the national park. Tigers are there providing global goods, but they are also costing me. So in that sense, in some sense, nature also provides these services. And how do we capture that? So in that context, they collectively refer it as nature's contribution to people. It could be mostly positive for the most part, but there could be some instances where it could be negative. So this particular nature's contribution to people or ecosystem services and goods are the conduit by which nature contributes to good quality of life. Of course, Millennium Ecosystem Assessment characterize it in slightly different way, but the link is more or less the same. Then a good quality of life, having a good quality of life has influence on the institutions and governance and other indirect drivers that could affect nature. Those indirect drivers, obviously, policies, economic policies, socio-political things, and all those sort of things affect nature directly. So we refer them as, they trigger direct drivers, which are habitat conversion, exploitation, we can name many. They ultimately affect nature. When nature is being affected, it affects the service or goods it provides. And then ultimately it might have impact on good quality of life, what we think of. Sometimes the natural drivers or earthquake, for example, or any sort of natural event could directly to some degree affect the quality of life. So that's how this institution and governance or indirect drivers play a central part, which also has a link between cultures and the systems in which people operate. Besides that, it also permeates these different areas through anthropogenic asset, means what we build capital, human capital, social capital, or financial capital, they will, through this, somehow, this institution and governance interact with the nature's contribution to people or good quality of life, and then that sort of impact will also be there. So it's a very complex thing. They try to capture it in this way, and also in terms of the time, look at the past and develops the situation what we are facing right now and project something for the future. That's the other task they do. In a spatial sense, they also look at from very local context to the global context. But if you look at actually what they do
They look at the cases or evidence based on local to national kind of scenarios, but then they project a little bit about the global scenarios, depending on the available evidence base. So in some sense, they look at whole range from local to global. So on that basis, they perform those 4 functions. And one of the things about this, when we think about their operating approach, is they consider what they call diverse values of nature and its contribution, or diverse values of nature that we enjoy or use, which may depend on cultural and institutional context in which we are interacting with the nature. So that is the link which is now forcing me to go back from IPBES to values. So my research question, there are no research questions. The question is, I'm trying to explain what do they mean by value in their context, and then what do they mean by valuation, and how do they look at the studies, value-related studies or valuation studies, and what's their suggestion in terms of thinking about the valuation process. So I'm going to explain a little bit about that. And then at the very end, I will make some observation based on some of the things I know, what many people here are doing, or some of the colleagues in the university. I have recently noticed some of the things happening in the Fijori River, how they have captured some of these ideas in their research. Okay, so value. I know I'm trying to do it, but I know I'm not a good person to explain what value means. It means many things to many people, depending on your perspective. It could be just a principle in which we operate, or it could just be a preference over a couple of things, and I put higher value to one as opposed to the other. It could also be an importance we allocate to different things when we are looking at. If we think this is important, we are revealing our value in some ways. Or it can also be used as a measure when you compare different things. So it means many things to many people, depending on the perspective you hold. So as an example, farmers may value the food they produce in different ways. It's the same food, but farmers can consider it to be a pure market commodity and think from more economic point of view what the value of that food they produce would be, or it can be an integral part of their continued cultural identity. Some people value these things. Oh, this farmer named, oh, apple producer or orange producer or something, that can characterize their cultural identity as well. So it means different things. Having this different spectrum of values by which we attribute meaning and importance to this ecosystem service, by the way, NCP, nature's contribution to people, ecosystem services, I think it is a little bit harsh word to say rarely, but that's what they have said. It is increasingly being recognized, but it's not to the extent that we think it should be. Recognized or explicitly taken into the account in decision making. I know some of you here who are expert working in this field, and if we think about non-market valuation and the great results that have been generated through this, to what extent they have reached to the policy making is a question. That is what happening if we think about the other context as well. Then identifying these diverse values that individuals or social groups have on nature is also challenging. I know I don't see our students working up in the north, how challenging it could be if you want to characterize or identify these diverse values of nature, looking from individuals to different social groups. But we can't give up, because if we don't do so, then what happens is it undermines the very objective of decision making, which will generate the unsustainable outcomes. So in order to have sustainable outcomes, we need to capture this. We know it is difficult, but if we give up, then we will continue into the trajectory, which is not what we wanted. So in that context, IPBES thinks about values of nature or ecosystem services or how it contributes to people's life. And then they have two broad principles in which they operate. The first one is valuation and value assessment require the recognition of a broad range of worldviews. So it means, of course, we have our disciplinary boundaries and we operate within that. But at least we need to recognize that there is a broader perspective that is equally, or maybe even if not equally, there is some degree of importance of all those things. So that's what they take on board. The worldviews broadly defined into two groups: Western science perspective versus indigenous and local knowledge-based worldviews. What it does is, if we recognize that, then it empowers, or it promotes different conceptualization of value and valuation approaches. Okay, I'm going into the approaches, but let's hold this. But the values means, as I try to explain you, looking at that one example of the food that farmers produce. So it could be looked at in different way. The values conceptualization could be different. So it helps if we consider those. Then also promote transdisciplinary collaboration in the work, which is oftentimes we talk about and which is needed. And the second thing, it is also conscious of thinking about the principle is the fact that incorporation of values and a particular valuation method into decision-making process are themselves value-laden. So when you choose something, already we determine that particular perspective. Means it depends on our value system. It depends on the way we look at the relationship between nature and human well-being, or nature and other things. So we need to be cognizant of this situation. Then based on that, then they start to talk and describe about the values. So broadly speaking, there are a couple of terms that might be a little bit catchy here. They mention about foci of value, 3 broad areas, same link I mentioned earlier, nature's contribution to people, to the good quality of life. They consider them as 3 foci of value. And then there are, I think for intrinsic value, nature itself has its value. So irrespective of whether we use it or not, it has value. And we reflect it in some ways. These days we talk about animal welfare, for example. Even if we don't use it for whatever the purpose we are thinking, but nature has its intrinsic value. That's the one particular foci. And then the nature's contribution to people or the ecosystem services are generally grouped into instrumental value, but not exclusively. Mostly instrumental value, means they are means to the end. But there is a spectrum which can go all the way from some level of, let's say, habitat creation or maintenance of habitat for biodiversity or something would be an example of instrumental value. Then all the way to the other end, where there is a fuzzy line between instrumental and relational value. Relational values are the values we derive from our interaction with nature. They are not directly coming from nature, but depending on the interdependency, depending on how we interact with nature, relational values are derived. For example, this cultural identity I highlighted earlier is a relational value. This is in the way how IPBES characterize value. It doesn't mean that other ways are, this is the better way or not. That's not the point. But the main thing is between instrumental and relational values, it is a spectrum. There is no clear boundary over there. But for the most part, when you think about it, good quality of life are mostly relational values. Nature's contribution to people or ecosystem services are mostly instrumental values. And when you think about nature itself, it's mostly the intrinsic value. Then, okay, that's how the value is being defined. Then how do we do the valuation? Well, given those 2 broad perspectives I alluded earlier, one could think of a valuation approach, or what they call value framing, based on a disciplinary perspective, or singularity in this sense. They call it unidimensional framing. It could be, let's say, economics dominated or economic dominated valuation, where we primarily use economic valuation. If we look at here, those nature's contribution to people and good quality of life as separate things, which are the foci of values, we look at nature's contribution to people. Ecosystem services, the policy objective is primarily economic oriented, and then we use economic valuation. We might use the policy support tools based on what we get from the economic valuation, or using in cost benefit analysis, and maybe design economic incentive to conserve, protect, or manage the nature. And then those institutions and governance, these things will feed into the institution and governance, which were the central point of their framework, and that will help to manage or conserve nature. And it's a one perspective. You can have ecological dominated valuation or socio-cultural dominated valuation, which means even though we focus on the same foci of value, our policy objective might be a little bit different, which means we might derive slightly different policy suggestions. As a parallel, or as opposed to that, if we can think of what they call pluralistic valuation, which accommodates different or diverse values together from different perspectives, and it is more tuned to what people call socio-ecological perspective, means you consider sort of interdisciplinary approach to think about it. And in this framing, this nature, ecosystem service, and good quality of life are seen as interdependent. They are connected, and it requires activating deliberative approaches when there is a value conflict arises. Because when we can think of this, we can value the same object or same ecosystem service from different perspectives. But when you need to bridge or integrate these things, then there is inherently we will face challenges. And how do we deal with that? And one of the ways is, that's what it is called, deliberative approach might be a way to bring these different trade-offs or incommensurability of value, because they are not comparable. They are not the apple and the apple in many sense. If that is the case, then how do we do that? Of course, there are some ways, methods that we can use. Then derive policy suggestion based on that, which might be better in terms of conserving nature and promoting conservation or generating more ecosystem service and so forth. So this perspective of a pluralistic valuation, it doesn't mean that you have to do multiple valuations to look at the same thing. But if there are many different ways people have looked at the values of a nature from different perspectives, how do you bring them together is the question. If you have resource, if we can afford it, then of course it might be better to look at from different perspectives. But oftentimes that's not practical. In that sense, how do we reconcile this would remain a question. So this pluralistic approach aims to bridge different value dimensions. We talk about this value dimension, whether it is focused on ecosystem service or nature itself or good quality of life, and also provide opportunity to bridge these nature's contribution to people related values in terms of different ways we can value this or different perspectives. And it acknowledges the existence of different perception of what constitutes a good life. What does mean good life could be different for different perspectives. So it allows, at least it acknowledges that is there. There is no one way of thinking about good life, but there are different ways we can characterize it as good life. And also acknowledge the role of institutions. So within this framework, that's how they advocate, in some sense, how do we look at the valuation, try to in some sense, let's extend our hands beyond what we think we can do from a single disciplinary perspective. Or even if we do from single disciplinary perspective, can we bring it together for policy suggestions? Well, here is an example of their approach. How do they suggest to do valuation? It doesn't mean that, like I said earlier, this is one way based on their model which they use to look at these assessments and other suggestions what they make. 5 practical 5 steps with this approach is not different than what you might think you are doing. But let me go and then explain what those 5 steps are. It aims to facilitate the comparability of valuation results as well as transparency and accountability of the valuation process. So sometimes what happens is a researcher goes to the field, do valuation exercise and bring numbers and work with that, great. But the reciprocity of what does that mean to those stakeholders who are going to be impacted by that as a process perhaps remains opaque in some instances. So this means engagement with them, being transparent and being accountable in the process is also important. The first thing is, we all know this. I think I'll just go ahead and describe it, but we know it. In the center, we have diverse values of nature's contribution to people. Diverse values are there. If we need to value this, then first of all, we go back to what's the purpose, why we are doing it. And it could be just for decision making, just to raise the awareness, or for accounting purposes in some cases, or for some decision making in the context of legal battle. For example, the Gulf of Mexico, the BP oil spill had a significant impact on the nature in Gulf of Mexico, and BP has to pay something, so there was a litigation. So what's the value? So it could be of many different purposes. Then when we scope the process, then we think about, of course we know our disciplinary focus, but what would be the best? We need to delineate that process in terms of the worldviews, in terms of the values that we are focusing on, in terms of the value type. The focus of value, is it about the nature? Is it about the nature's contribution to people? Or is it about the good quality of life as it relates to the nature's contribution to people? Or is it instrumental or intrinsic or relational value? And also, what is the spatial extent? What's the temporal dimension? What's the social organizational scale we are looking at? Once we delineate that, then, of course, we invoke a valuation method. Pluralistic in the sense that there are more than one way we can do, for example, economic valuation method. We are familiar with that. There could be what we call biophysical way of thinking about the valuation method, or holistic or indigenous and local knowledge-based method. Which method is more suited to the given scope to answer the objective that you have set first? When we undertake the valuation, the plurality of worldviews, which obviously leads to diversity of values, so there will be heterogeneous methods that can come into play, and their integration will be required. So the point is, if possible, we might want to look at from multiple worldviews. If not, if we are looking at the same object or same sort of setting in which we are valuing, and there are multiple methods coming into play, and we know that from the literature, how do we bring that together? When we bring that together, diversity of value across different value foci will involve value trade-off and incommensurability among the values, and some approach would help to possibly diffuse that, and which is the step what they refer here as integration and bridging. The choice of approach itself to integrate will include some element of valuation itself. So I mentioned that this is a value-laden process, and being a transparent and participatory process may be required to leverage social power relations over diverse values. We are talking about, we just had an example over here. Perhaps it's not squarely related to value, but indigenous communities site, the cultural sites or historical sites versus let's say a company's perspective on their operation that led into some sort of dispute, or at least we know then there has been some problem in relation to that. That might primarily come from how do we view things in relation to the values we put on the resource. So ultimately, when you do that, or we are able to integrate or bridge those things, of course, there are many different methods: integrated modeling, multi-criteria analysis, narrative analysis, deliberative valuation, and those are there. They help to integrate this pluralistic value coming from different valuation methods. And ultimately, we have to communicate it to the stakeholders, or perhaps to the decision maker, with what degree of confidence we have on those values coming from whether it is a singular or multi pluralistic approach that we have invoked. On this one, the notion of IPBES, the way they would like to see it is what they call policy relevant language than policy prescriptive language. And I think it is, to some degree, it is important this behavioral science and behavioral economics. Maybe those research are telling us how do we portray something might affect how do we take it. But they always refer to, even if we have to frame something, the should, must, those type of words are not there when they bring their policy suggestions. So using that sort of approach, they have thus far looked at a number of what they call assessments. I'm not going to talk here about the other things they have done. So far, I think they have finished 7 different assessments. Some of them are specifically related to a particular theme, and most of them are about regional or global biodiversity and ecosystem services. And at the moment, they are running these three different assessments, which are referred as values assessment is one, sustainable use of wild species assessment, and invasive alien species assessment. So the purpose is to generate the evidence base, looking from different worldviews and developing some policy relevant suggestions so that there will be some different course of action in terms of conserving nature and environment. Well, my observation, so I have been involved in this process for the last 6 years by now, from 2014 in different steps. I had a role to play in some of these valuations. What I observe is the value monism will remain there. So the disciplinary way of thinking about value, it's not going to go away. It will remain there. And we oftentimes have quite a bit of tense debate in the table when we different group of people come together, economists, sociologists, anthropologists, ILK knowledge holders, then we have a different way of thinking about it. So that sort of value monism approach will remain. It won't go. But the point is, the acceptance of value pluralism in practice is increasing. So it is increasing means working together, integrating different knowledge systems to work on the same topic. For example, there is a commentary on Earth, science must embrace traditional and indigenous knowledge to solve our biodiversity crisis. So the means is, if we want to achieve a collective goal, then we might have to work collaboratively or going beyond our disciplinary boundaries. That is increasing, that's what I see. There is an increasing use of multiple worldviews and integrated evaluation. Of course, I don't need to elaborate this. So it is happening, it is increasing. Even we are focusing on our disciplinary approach, we are extending hands. That tradition is being flourishing. Here is another interesting example from, I alluded earlier, from Australia itself. And I'll come to that. And I have no idea whatsoever is here, but what I'm trying to focus is this ILK system has been treated equally in the IPBES process, but there are limited evidence base exist based on peer-reviewed literature, but are emerging. The point is, when it comes to that knowledge system, it is a tradition. It passes on generation to generation. It depends on many different ways how they have captured their knowledge. You can't simply look at the literature and try to find it. But when you want to give an equal treatment, then somehow you have to find a way how you capture that knowledge. So that was a significant lack from the very beginning, and IPBES started a significant effort how to embrace the ILK-based knowledge system, holding different knowledge-based, holding different workshops to ILK knowledge holders, and trying to bring their knowledge into the form that can be referred in this type of assessment. And the challenge still remains in bridging and integrating the values, whether it is revealed, or whether it is coming from stated or revealed process of different worldviews or approaches I mentioned earlier. That challenge is still there. How to bridge it so that everyone is happy, that is still a challenge. But this is some work done in northern part of Western Australia by our colleague here, Michael Douglas, and they published it, I think it was last year they published it. I have no clue what is here, but what I know is, if you look at the main dimension, what they have looked at, the use and well-being of the population, or what kind of use they have. In particular, it's about the water allocation planning, about the water, and the state governments and institutions. Those institutions and governance at the state level is being captured. Indigenous governance and institutions is being captured in the other end, and also the custodial responsibilities at nested scales at different levels. So what is our responsibilities as well? So I thought that, yes, this sort of things are happening more and more. I know in our group itself, there are different projects, people are working on this space, and it is evolving. So that's what it is emerging, but it is still lacking in terms of that comparative analysis or that needs to be done for IPBES purposes. I mentioned this, the influencing policy through scientific evidence depends partly on communication. Of course, we generate robust scientific evidence, that's the first, that's the necessity, but that's not sufficient. How do we portray that information to policymakers may have a slightly different bearing. That's what they call policy relevant language. And the behavioral psychology or behavioral economics, I'm not quite familiar with this field. I know a little bit, but those fields have a significant role to play on how to frame these things in order to bring real transformative change. That's what the people advocates. So in order to bring transformative change in nature conservation, that needs policy integration that consider different values, value systems, and worldviews. We need heterogeneity in the way how we think about, but heterogeneity itself might be a problematic word. When you have different type of opinion, different value system, how you bring them together? Of course, by some means, we have to have a buy-in on these sort of things. Otherwise, what happens is, we know this. This is a result of the global assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem services. Here in the first column, we have nature's contribution to people of different types. Let me not go and detail this, but what we know is these arrows all are heading down. That means things are not getting better over time. The other things, the directional trend across region. If you think about within a region, what's happening ups and down in many cases, and we see different sort of scenario, but globally, if you look at things are not looking great. We'll encountered that sort of situation. So my message is we need to act, we need to avoid this otherwise situation. And I need to thank these authors who have written, I'm part of it, but who have written this paper through this IPBES related engagement. I think it's a product of that intense discussion and that happened over the years. And there are very many authors actually. So I don't know, you can't find me here. I'm somewhere there, but you can't find me. But the point of this is, I think for good or bad, this has been picked up quite widely by the academic community or scientific community. And this paper itself is standard as one of the top cited paper in the web of science up until now. So I don't know perhaps good or bad, I don't know. But the point is, I think there was significant critique, and there was a paper published in Science about the IPBES approach by some other group, and IPBES went back and tried to put forward their opinion. At least the academic debate has risen up, and at least the awareness has been rising up. At least that's the outcome. With that, I'd like to end here. I think I took all of the time available, and this is a slide that Asa asked me to show, and it's here. I'm going to talk about the next thing. Oops. Okay, so, thank you very much. If you have any question, please. I know Michael has a question. Okay.
So so the critical bit in terms of plurality is that point at which everything comes together. So and tries to integrate across all these competing values of people saying this is obviously the right way to do it. So how have you seen how those have worked, and how successful do you think those are? What comes out of that process? What actually gets resolved out of that process in terms of the decisions that are made?
Okay, the question is, when it comes to bring different perspectives together and to make a decision, the pluralistic way of thinking about value, and then what comes out of it and how that evolves. Is that the question? I think, how do they do it? Okay. Yep, I completely agree with your sentiment. These are apple and oranges. How do you bring that together? The incommensurability of value itself is there. But the way how IPBES is advocating, we might not have a full, that's why I said this value monism will remain. But how we might do that in practice, for example, in Europe these days, I start to hear that deliberative valuation. You bring this together. Once different perspectives and values derived from those things are on the table, you bring these people, and there is a slightly different way of weighing those things and trying to come up with some sort of solution. But I know not everybody will be equally happy as a result of that. That's the approach they are advocating. But of course, the stakeholders, I mentioned about this, you want to represent, or you need to have these stakeholders who are part of it, who are affected by this, and you follow that process. That's the suggestion they have. And increasingly, I see in Europe, there is a literature evolving in terms of, perhaps over here too, I'm exaggerating that in that sense because I have seen one or two papers from there. You need to have a representative. Those things, value-laden, I mentioned that. So who we choose to be in the table itself has implication. So you want to be inclusive as much as possible in terms of discussing those things. And then I think there is no win and no lose would be a good thing than win and lose. So that's what I envision, and that's what they want to do. That's what their suggestion is. Sorry.
Examples of where that's actually being implemented, and are there examples where that's actually implemented and had an outcome?
In terms of, for example, that is, you'll see this value assessment currently that is happening. We are intensely debating this, how to integrate that, because you are doing it from many different ways. But in practical terms, if you are looking at a particular case, for example, in this one they have done it. The idea of going back and talking to community and reconfirming it is happening in some of those examples I mentioned in Europe. I think I don't have on top of my head to give you, this is the example, you look at how they have done. But in the assessment process, this is also equally applied to the assessment process. What happens is this intense debate happens between different parties who are in the room, and then there is some compromise. What is workable to the different stakeholders, and that's how they have decided. And there are caveats to that. That's how they have done in their assessment reports. Sorry.
So I've been recently having some battles with people, marine biology students for one, and also other people around the value of native forest in Western Australia to different groups. And I keep on saying, well, you know, use cost-benefit analysis and value things that way, but actually it's very hard to get people away from saying, no, it's the number of jobs that are important. And so I don't know if you, in this process, do you pick up that quite often there's almost a sort of non-attendance of standard economic values in many evaluations. It's almost has a negligible weight, or the economic values are converted to something else that economists wouldn't usually value. It's jobs that are,
you know,
and I'm fighting. I
No.
can help here.
No, you are absolutely.
Well,
No.
I had a fight with the.
I guess.
Fight with beekeepers.
No, you are right, Ben. I think one of the I think it's not a blame, but what people always say is the decision makings are affected by economic thinking, and that's why other things were not considered. That sort of debate happens when you are in the table. The intense debate comes in that way. Always economic. Sometimes people are feared of monetary valuation. They would like to do that. Really, I'm being serious. That's how they view. But the point is, you can't get away out of that, because decision makers looks at the numbers. Still, that's the case. The numbers comes from how many jobs you are going to create, how many additional things you are going to make out of it. Those are fundamental decision-making parameters. But the point is, you can't get away with that. But on top of that, or in parallel to that, other things are also important. Let's broaden the toolbox or the information set for the decision maker so that they can make informed decision considering that. But it's not going to go away. I think.
I think my challenge is that the economics is reduced down to the number of jobs created.
Yeah.
The measure of value. You know, it's almost that the economic values are
misrepresented in that sense.
Misspecified.
That is increasing.
I wonder if there's also, you know, whether there's another layer of values, which is like political values, that job creation is important to politicians because they quite often, you know, expect jobs. Morrison's mantra.
I agree.
More jobs.
That is not fully understood or less appreciated. You can think of that. That is there. That is happening. Then yes. And then
ultimately, the choice between the values is socio-political. You cannot get away from that. It doesn't matter what numbers you put up. The ultimate decision will be socio-political. And how you resolve that, let me know.
Yes, Dan.
I very much appreciate the intent to think broadly about values, but I really worry about the philosophy of, well, we'll just generate these values in all sorts of disparate ways, and then somehow we'll mung them together at the end, even though they're not comparable in any meaningful way. And I worry that at that stage you almost get a random outcome because the things you're combining are not really combinable.
No denial on that. But the point is, perhaps, like I mentioned, there are incommensurable values. You can't compare. Sometimes the
I feel like they've sort of sidestepped a responsibility to work out the logic of this system and work within a better defined logic, rather than say, oh, we'll just anything goes and then we'll mung it together by some very loose process.
I think, sorry, going back to that is, once you have a very well-defined purpose, and then when it comes to the choice of the method, that's where, what particular method would you choose given the purpose and the scope, then there might be there might be only limited things you may need to do. But sometimes what happens is we might do multiple methods to bring it, which is not practical in many cases. But defining your question and framing is equally important. In framing, if you start to think about the broader perspective, I think that might be okay. At least you have considered this in the framing. If you can show that, that might work. But the challenge is, I completely agree, but the challenge is integrating it, coming from different point of view about the same thing, done in a, perhaps in a different way, is challenging. There is no, like I said, there is no win-win outcome. That's fact.
So it's not challenging, it's impossible. You know, it's sort of like a task they shouldn't have even tried.
That's what the challenge is. That is continuing. That debate is there. It is not resolved. And I mentioned about the values assessment. At the moment, we are in the second order draft. There is intense debate. The economists are there, natural resource economists, bioeconomists, sociologists, anthropologists, because they bring everybody together. But this debate is continuing. They are buzzing a little bit, but sometimes for the very reason, they are accepting some uncomfortable things as well. That's true.
And also there is a challenge that when you want to do a valuation study, you have to do all this. And given the task and time and resources, can you do this that way? So
no. That's the condition. That's the condition. If you want to do it, it's a resource intensive in the fullest extent. That constraint is there if you want to do it in multiple ways. But the point is, even I think if we improve the first bit, defining precisely scoping. When you scope it, if you scope widely, then if you can say we have done the scoping in that way, then that might take care of something which will come later in terms of when values are revealed. But it is a challenging, I would say, field, and this debate between transdisciplinary is there, and we see biophysical things are considered in economic valuation. That sort of integration is happening. But in terms of the worldviews, that's where the fundamental things are. And they are a completely different way of thinking. How do you bring together is, I don't know this answer, but it is a tough thing. I agree. Okay, is there? Yeah. No?
I'll make another comment if there's a gap. So Ken and I have been involved with Milena, who's been the main person in the Kimberley.
Yeah, I remember. I know that.
Part of that process, and we've sort of been trying to do something a bit like this in a way, where we're trying to combine values and perspectives and preferences of very different community groups in the community. And in some cases, in some cases, quite conflicting worldviews and perspectives. And it's been incredibly difficult. And one way that we've dealt with that is by not trying to wrap it up into something tiny, but by presenting, the report is going to present the results in a sort of a semi-process way, not trying to sort of stitch it down to a small number of numbers, but here's graphs that show the array of responses that we've got for different types of well-being categories that people were rating and so that's one
way to do it.
And leave it to the decision makers as to what they do with that. But the other thing that I'd comment on is, so this is just focusing on one issue in one region, and it's been a nightmare in many ways, right? And so I wonder how you could possibly do it at a national level. It seems like just the logistics alone of getting the groups together and getting them to talk to each other civilly is almost impossible.
You are 100% right. I don't know yet to comment on that, but what I realize is, I think these values held by people are so deep. They comes whenever there is a avenue to bring it, they come forward. So I think one of the ways is recognizing that and bringing in the way as you described. Here are the things you need to consider. We are not judging which is better or worse, but these are the things you need to think about it when you make decisions. That is a step forward, I think. I think these things are very sentimental, or very much attached to their feelings and so forth. They are not going to go away. At least I sense now in the IPBES community is they are moving, both in broad sense, both groups are moving in the areas where those sort of things can be put together, but that tension is continuing. Are there any questions from our colleague who are in the Zoom link? Okay, thank you very much. Awesome.